A homeless widow inherited a $5 farmhouse that had been sealed for 40 years. What she found inside would unravel a family secret of sacrifice, fear, and a love strong enough to echo through time. If you've ever felt lost, like the world has forgotten you, then you know what it's like to look for a sign, any sign at all. This is the story of the sign I found. And if you stick with me, maybe you'll find a piece of your own story in it too. Don't forget to subscribe if you believe in second chances, because that's what we talk about here. We talk about the hard stuff. The air in my Honda Civic smelled like stale coffee and desperation. It had been my home for 6 months, ever since the last of the money from Liam's life insurance had been swallowed by the hospital bills his death had left behind. Every morning, I'd wake up with a crick in my neck from the headrest and the ghostly imprint of the seatbelt buckle on my cheek. The world outside the fogged-up windows was a blur of indifferent parking lots and rest stops. I was 29 years old, a widow, and my entire existence had been compressed into a 2008 sedan that was one bad alternator away from becoming a stationary tin can. Grief is a physical thing. It's a weight in your bones, a constant, low-grade fever that makes everything feel muted and distant. After Liam died, the world lost its color. It became a series of gray, necessary motions. Find a safe place to park. Find a gas station bathroom to wash up in. Find enough change for a cup of coffee that would serve as breakfast and lunch. I was a ghost haunting the edges of a life I no longer recognized. The letter arrived at the P.O. box I kept, the last flimsy tether to a world of addresses and mailboxes. It was from the tax assessor's office of a county I'd never heard of, Sparrow Creek. The envelope was thin and official, the kind that usually brings bad news. I almost threw it away. Bad news was a luxury I couldn't afford. It required energy to process, and I was running on empty. But I opened it anyway, my fingers clumsy from the cold. The letter was dense with legal jargon, but a few words snagged in the tangled net of my mind. Probate, final heir, Liam Caldwell, and Orchard End Farm. It spoke of a derelict property, a blight on the county records for nearly 40 years. It had belonged to Liam's grandfather, a man he'd never met. The property had accrued decades of back taxes, rendering it worthless to the county except for the land it sat on. A development corporation, monolithic and faceless, was set to acquire it. But there was a clause, a dusty old municipal ordinance designed to prevent rural decay. As the last known heir, I was entitled to claim the property. The cost was a $5 filing fee. The catch was a mountain. I would have 1 year to bring the property to a habitable state and begin a payment plan for the 40 years of taxes. If I failed, the property and everything on it would be forfeited to the developers. I laughed. It was a harsh, raw sound in the quiet of my car. A $5 farmhouse. It sounded like a fairy tale for broke people, a cruel joke. I had $7.25 in a cup holder. The $5 fee was manageable. The rest of it, the taxes, the repairs, the very idea of a habitable state was an impossible dream. But then I looked around my cramped, cold car. I looked at the condensation tracing patterns on the glass, patterns of my own breath, proof that I was still here. What was the alternative? Another 6 months of this? A year? The slow, grinding erosion of my soul until there was nothing left but the shell of a person. The letter was an absurdity. It was a joke. But it was also the first thing that had happened to me, rather than at me, in a long time. It was a choice, however ridiculous. I could stay in this parking lot, or I could drive toward the name on the envelope. Sparrow Creek. It sounded like a place that didn't exist anymore. Maybe I didn't either. Maybe that's where I belonged. I started the car, the engine rattling in protest, and used the last of my data to find Sparrow Creek on a map. It was 300 miles north, a tiny dot in a sea of green that meant forests and fields and nothing else. I spent 2 of my $7 on gas, and with a $5 bill tucked carefully into my pocket, I pointed the nose of my car north and drove away from the life that was no longer a life at all. The drive was a long, hypnotic ribbon of gray asphalt. I passed through towns that blurred into one another, each with its own quiet melancholy. The further north I got, the more the world seemed to exhale. The tight knot of highways and suburbs loosened into rolling hills and wide-open sky. The air changed. It smelled of damp earth and pine, a clean, sharp scent that felt like it was scouring the dust from my lungs. I arrived in Sparrow Creek on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't so much a town as a crossroads with a post office, a general store with a rusted gas pump out front, and a handful of houses that looked like they were leaning on each other for support. The county courthouse was a small, severe-looking brick building that seemed too grand for its surroundings. I parked my car, my home, and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. A pale, tired face stared back, eyes shadowed with a grief that had become a permanent part of my features. I looked like a ghost. I took a deep breath, clutching the $5 bill in my hand like a talisman, and walked inside. The air inside the courthouse was warm and smelled of old paper and lemon polish. A woman with a kind, weary face directed me to the clerk of records, a man named Arthur Abernathy. His office was a cramped space, a canyon of filing cabinets and teetering stacks of manila folders. Mr. Abernathy himself was a man who seemed to be made of the same materials as his office, a little worn, a little faded, but sturdy and functional. He had silver hair and glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked at me over the rims, his expression unreadable. "You're the Caldwell heir?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly hum. I nodded, unable to speak. I felt like a fraud, an imposter claiming a name and a place that meant nothing to me. "I'm Ilara, Liam's wife." He nodded slowly, his eyes softening with something that looked like pity. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am." Liam's name came up on the ancestry trace. We were sorry to learn of his passing. He gestured to a chair, a rickety wooden thing that groaned under my weight. He spent the next hour explaining the situation in plain English, cutting through the legalese of the letter. The farm, Orchard End, had belonged to Arthur Caldwell, Liam's grandfather. 40 years ago, he and his wife, Eleanor, had simply vanished. The house was boarded up, the taxes went unpaid, and the property fell into a legal limbo. Their only son, Liam's father, had died years ago in a car accident, long before Liam was even a thought. The county had tried to trace any living relatives for decades with no luck. Now, with the pressure from the developers, they had done one last exhaustive search. And they found Liam, and then me. "It's not a gift, Mrs. Caldwell," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice gentle but firm. "It's a burden, a heavy one. The back taxes amount to nearly $50,000. The house, well, the house hasn't been touched in 4 decades. We sent a surveyor out to the property line last year. He didn't go inside. Didn't have to. Said it was a teardown." He slid a photograph across the desk. It was grainy and faded, but the image was clear enough. A 2-story farmhouse, once white, now a peeling, spectral gray. The windows were dark, vacant eyes, covered with weathered boards. The porch roof sagged like a broken jaw. It was surrounded by a sea of overgrown weeds and skeletal-looking trees that clawed at the sky. It wasn't a house. It was a tombstone. The developers, a company called Northridge Holdings, have offered to pay the back taxes and a clearance fee to the county in exchange for the land. They want to build luxury cabins, a resort for city folks. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Frankly, that's the sensible option. It brings jobs, revenue. Your option, it's a long shot. The ordinance was written for people with resources, with a plan. Not... He trailed off, but I heard the unspoken words. Not for someone who looks like you. Not for a ghost living out of her car. I understand, I whispered, my voice hoarse. But it's the only option I have. His gaze held mine for a long moment. I expected him to argue, to try and talk me out of it, to tell me to take what little I had and disappear. Instead, he just sighed, a long, slow release of air. All right then, he said, pulling a stack of forms from a drawer. Let's get you your farm. I paid the $5 bill. It felt both monumental and insignificant. He stamped the papers with a heavy, satisfying thud, the sound of a door closing on one life and opening onto another. He handed me a thick, rusted iron key. This was in the original deed file. It's for the front door, assuming the lock hasn't seized after 40 years. He drew a simple map on the back of a napkin. It's about 5 miles out of town. You can't miss it. It's the last house on Old Mill Road. The road itself is barely a road anymore. He stood up, offering me his hand. His grip was firm, dry. Good luck, Mrs. Caldwell. I mean that. I walked out of the courthouse and back into the crisp autumn air, the iron key cold and heavy in my hand. It felt less like a key and more like an anchor. I didn't know if it was meant to hold me steady or pull me under. I got back in my car, my one constant, and followed the map out of town, driving toward a ruin that was now, impossibly, mine. The pavement of the main road gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a rutted dirt track overgrown with weeds. Mr. Abernathy was right. It was barely a road. The trees on either side leaned in, their branches interlocking overhead, forming a dark, skeletal tunnel. My little Civic scraped and bumped along, the sound of twigs and thorns screeching against the metal like angry fingernails. After a mile that felt like 10, the tunnel opened up into a clearing. And there it was, the house from the photograph. It was worse in person. The picture hadn't captured the oppressive silence, the sheer weight of neglect that seemed to press down on the very air. The gray paint was almost entirely gone, leaving the wood beneath exposed and silvered like old bones. The porch had collapsed on one side, its roof hanging at a drunken angle. The weeds weren't just weeds. They were a jungle of thorny bushes and vines that seemed to be actively trying to pull the house back into the earth. It was utterly, profoundly abandoned, a place where time had simply stopped. I parked the car and got out, the sound of the door closing echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I stood there for a long time, just looking. Fear was a cold knot in my stomach. This wasn't a project, it was an archaeology site. What had I done? This was a mistake. A $5 mistake that had cost me my last hope. I should turn around, drive away, and never look back. But where would I go? Back to the parking lots? Back to being invisible? No, I had come this far. I had to see it through. I had to at least step inside. I pushed my way through the thorny brush, my jeans catching and tearing. The porch steps groaned in protest but held my weight. The front door was a solid, imposing thing, its wood swollen and cracked. The windows on either side were covered with thick planks of wood, nailed shut from the outside. The keyhole was clogged with rust and spiderwebs. I slid the old iron key in. It grated, resisted. I put my shoulder into it, twisting with all my might. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening shriek of rusted metal, the lock turned. The sound was like a scream that had been held in for 40 years. I pushed the door. It was stuck fast, swollen in its frame. I threw my body against it, again and again, my shoulder screaming in protest. Finally, with a splintering crack, it gave way, swinging inward into darkness. The air that rolled out was thick and cold, carrying the smell of dust, decay, and something else. something faintly sweet and musty, like dried flowers and forgotten memories. It was the smell of a sealed tomb. I stood on the threshold, peering into the gloom. The inside of the house was a landscape of shadows. The boarded windows let in only slivers of light, thin blades that cut through the darkness and illuminated floating motes of dust. Everything was draped in a thick, gray blanket of it. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly chandeliers. I took a tentative step inside, my boots crunching on a carpet of grit and fallen plaster. I was in what must have been a living room. The shapes of furniture were visible beneath the dust. A sofa, a pair of armchairs, a coffee table. They looked like gray, silent ghosts huddled together in the dark. On one wall, a grand stone fireplace stood cold and empty, a dark mouth waiting to speak. To my right, a staircase ascended into an even deeper darkness. I ran my hand along the back of the sofa, leaving a clean streak in the thick dust. The fabric beneath was a faded floral pattern, rough to the touch. I felt a strange sense of trespass, of intrusion. This wasn't just an abandoned house. It was a life, paused mid-sentence. My first task was to let in the light. I couldn't stay in this tomb. I went back outside to my car and got the tire iron from the trunk. It was the only tool I had. I went back to the porch and started working on the boards covering the living room windows. The nails were old and rusted, but they fought me every step of the way. I wedged the end of the tire iron under a board and pulled, my muscles straining. The wood groaned, then with a loud crack, it splintered, the nails screeching as they were torn from their 40-year grip. I worked my way around the window, prying off one board after another. Finally, the last one came free, and a rectangle of glorious, unfiltered afternoon light flooded into the room. It was like the house took a breath. The dust motes, previously invisible, now danced in the sunbeam like a million tiny stars. The light revealed the full extent of the decay. The wallpaper, a pattern of faded roses, was peeling away from the walls in long, curling strips. The plaster ceiling was stained and cracked, with a large section having fallen onto the floor. The wooden floors were warped and stained. But the light also revealed something else. It showed that the house had bones. Good bones. The walls were straight, the stone of the fireplace solid. Beneath the grime and decay, there was a structure that had been built to last. I spent the rest of the day prying boards off the downstairs windows, one by one. Each window opened was a small victory, a battle won against the darkness. By the time the sun began to set, the entire ground floor was filled with the warm, golden light of evening. It was still a wreck, but it was a wreck I could see. I could begin to map it out in my mind. That night, I didn't sleep in the house. I couldn't. It still felt like a stranger's place, a place holding its breath. I slept in my car, parked in the driveway, but it was different. I wasn't in a random parking lot. I was home. Or at least, I was at the address that was supposed to be home. The next morning, I began the real work, cleaning. I started in the kitchen. It was a time capsule from another era. A pale yellow refrigerator with a rounded top, a heavy enamel stove. The countertops were covered in a thick layer of grime. I found a bucket in the pantry and a stiff bristled brush. There was an old hand pump at the sink, and to my astonishment, when I worked the handle, it coughed and sputtered and then produced a stream of rusty, then clear, cold water. It must have been connected to a well. It was a small miracle. I spent 3 solid days just scrubbing the kitchen. My hands were raw, my back ached, but with every layer of grime I removed, I felt like I was reclaiming something. I was not just cleaning a room, I was erasing the neglect. I was showing the house that someone was here, someone cared. As I worked, I started to find small traces of the people who had lived here. In a kitchen drawer, I found a bundle of recipes, handwritten in a looping, elegant script on yellowed index cards. Apple pie, pot roast, buttermilk biscuits. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor, I was sure of it. In a cupboard, I found a stack of old magazines, their pages brittle with age. Life magazine. Look, the Saturday Evening Post. The dates were all from the early 1980s. One day, while sweeping out the living room, I found a small, tarnished silver locket on the floor near the fireplace. It must have fallen and been lost in the shadows. I pried it open with my thumbnail. Inside were two tiny, faded photographs. One was of a handsome man with kind eyes and a serious expression, Arthur. The other was of a smiling woman with a warm, open face, Eleanor. Staring at their faces, I felt a pang of connection. They weren't just names on a deed anymore. They were people who had loved each other, who had built a life in this house. Why had they left? Where had they gone? The question hung in the dusty air, a silent, unanswered mystery. The house was cold, especially at night. The autumn chill seeped through the cracks in the walls and the single-pane windows. The fireplace in the living room was my only source of heat. I spent an afternoon cleaning out the flue, pulling out 40 years of leaves and debris, and a surprisingly well-preserved bird's nest. I found a stack of dry, seasoned firewood in a shed out back, as if it had been left there yesterday, waiting for my arrival. That evening, I built my first fire. I sat on the floor, wrapped in the sleeping bag from my car, and watched the flames dance and leap in the hearth. The fire pushed back the cold and the darkness, filling the room with a warm, flickering light. It was the first time the house felt less like a tomb and more like a shelter. It was the first time I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since Liam died. Hope. It was a tiny, fragile thing, like the first spark of the fire, but it was there. And in the quiet of that old house, surrounded by the ghosts of a life I didn't know, it was enough. The days fell into a rhythm. Wake up with the sun, work on the house, scrape, scrub, sweep, repair. Eat a simple meal of canned soup or bread and cheese I'd bought at the general store in town. Fall into an exhausted sleep in my sleeping bag on the living room floor. I was slowly, painstakingly, bringing the house back to life. Or maybe it was bringing me back to life. The physical labor was grounding. It left no room for the spiraling thoughts of grief and despair that had consumed me for months. I couldn't afford to be sad when I was balanced on a ladder, patching a hole in the ceiling. I couldn't afford to be hopeless when I was wrestling with a stubborn window frame that refused to open. My grief was still there, a constant companion, but it had a new partner, purpose. I was working for more than just a roof over my head. I was working to honor the memory of the man who had unknowingly given me this chance. I was working for Liam. He had always dreamed of a place like this, a piece of land, a house with history. He would have loved the challenge, the satisfaction of seeing it come back from the brink. In a way, by saving the house, I felt like I was keeping a part of him alive. The first snow of the season came in late November. I woke up one morning to a world transformed. A thick blanket of white covered everything, softening the harsh lines of the broken porch and the skeletal trees. The silence was absolute, profound. It was beautiful, but it was also a stark reminder of the challenge ahead. Winter was coming. The house was far from weatherproof. The draft from the walls was a constant, cold breath. I knew I had to find the source. I started in the living room, running my hand along the old plaster walls, feeling for the telltale rush of cold air. I found it near the floor, behind one of the old armchairs. A section of the wall where the plaster had crumbled away, revealing the wooden lath beneath. As I poked at the soft spot, one of the lath boards came loose in my hand. It wasn't nailed in, it was just sitting there. Curiosity piqued, I pulled it away. Behind it was a dark, hollow space, the wall cavity. And inside that cavity, something was glinting. It was metal. My heart started to beat a little faster. I reached into the cold, dark space, my fingers brushing against a cold, hard surface. I gripped it and pulled. It was a metal box, an old ammunition can by the looks of it, heavy and solid. It was sealed with a rusty latch. I carried it over to the fireplace, my hands trembling slightly. This was something different. This wasn't a lost locket or a recipe card. This was hidden. This was deliberate. I sat on the floor in front of the fire, the metal box in my lap. It was heavier than it looked. I worked at the latch with the tip of my tire iron. It was stiff, but after a few moments of prying, it sprang open with a loud click. I lifted the lid. The inside was lined with what looked like oilcloth, protecting the contents from moisture. On top lay a thick bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath the letters were stacks of cash, held together with brittle rubber bands. And beneath the cash were several dozen savings bonds and a thick, folded document that looked like a deed. I just stared. It was a fortune. Not a vast one, but more money than I had ever seen in my life. Enough to pay the back taxes. Enough to properly fix the house. Enough to live on for years. Enough to walk away from this place and start a new life anywhere I wanted. My mind was reeling. Who would hide this? And why? I set the money and the papers aside, my hands shaking. I needed to understand. I picked up the bundle of letters. The paper was old and soft, the ink faded but still legible. The top letter was addressed to "My dearest Eleanor." The handwriting was strong and clear. I untied the ribbon and began to read. "My dearest Eleanor," the first letter began. "If you are reading this, then something has gone terribly wrong. I have not returned, and you have found this box as we planned. I pray this letter finds you and our boy safe. Do not grieve for me for long, my love. There is no time for that. You must be strong now. You must do exactly as I say." I read on, my heart pounding in my chest. The letter, dated October 1983, was from Arthur. He wrote that he had gotten involved with the wrong people. He had worked as a land surveyor for the county and had discovered that a powerful local family, connected to a new development company called Northridge, was illegally redrawing property lines, cheating small farmers out of their land and water rights. He had gathered evidence, intending to go to the state authorities, but they found out. They came to the farm. They threatened him. They threatened to harm Eleanor and their son. "They are not men of law, Eleanor," he wrote. "They are wolves. They will not stop. I cannot fight them and win. But I can protect you. I am going away. I have made it look like I have run off, a coward who abandoned his family. The shame of it burns me, but it is a price I will gladly pay if it keeps you safe. They will think I have taken the evidence with me. They will hunt for me, not for you." The letter went on to detail his plan. He had been saving money for years, a secret nest egg. He had hidden it in the wall, along with the original deed to the farm, which he had reported as lost to the county. His instructions were clear. Eleanor was to take their son, take the money, and disappear. Start a new life somewhere far away. Never look back. Let the farm fall to ruin. Let the wolves have the land. "A house is just wood and nails," he wrote. "A farm is just dirt. They are not worth your life. Our life, the one we built, is in our son. It is in the love we share. That is the only inheritance that matters. Forget this place. Forget me. Just live. Be happy. That is my final wish." I had to stop reading. Tears were streaming down my face. I cried for Arthur, for his impossible choice. I cried for Eleanor, for the terror she must have felt. I cried for their son, Liam's father, who had lost his father to a lie designed to save him. This wasn't a story of abandonment. It was a story of sacrifice, a story of a desperate, profound love. Arthur hadn't run away. He had laid down his life, his reputation, everything he had to build a wall around his family. And this house wasn't a ruin. It was the wall. I spent the rest of the night reading the letters. There were dozens of them. They weren't all instructions. Most were love letters. Arthur wrote to Eleanor about their life together, about the day they met, about the birth of their son. He wrote about his dreams for the farm, the trees he had planted, the barn he had hoped to build. He poured his heart onto the pages, a conversation with a woman he knew he might never see again. It was the most heartbreaking, beautiful thing I had ever read. He had sealed his love, his memory, and his hope for their future inside the walls of this house, a time capsule of a life stolen too soon. The last letter was different. It was short, written in a shaky hand. "They are close," it said. "I do not have much time. I love you, Eleanor. Always. Tell our son I was a good man." And that was it. The story ended. I sat in the flickering firelight, the letters spread around me, the weight of Arthur's story settling over me like a shroud. I looked at the stacks of money. It was a gift from a ghost, a lifeline from the past. But it felt heavy. It felt like blood money, paid for with a man's life. What was I supposed to do with it? Arthur's instructions were for Eleanor. Run, disappear, forget. But Eleanor was gone. Their son was gone. Liam was gone. There was only me. And now, here's where the story gets complicated. Because finding the truth is one thing, deciding what to do with it is another. I sat with that box for days, the money and the letters a constant, heavy presence in the room. And I want to pause here for a moment and talk to you. Yes, you. If you've made it this far, this story is resonating with you for a reason. Maybe you've had to deal with a complicated inheritance, not of money, but of stories, of secrets. We all have ghosts in our family history, don't we? People who made sacrifices we never understood, who made choices that echoed down through the generations. Have you ever uncovered a secret that changed the way you saw your entire family? That made you question everything you thought you knew? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Because this community, it's built on sharing these heavy stories, on knowing we're not alone in carrying them. The weight of the past is real. And what I was about to discover was that the past wasn't even past. It was right here, waiting for me. Okay, let's get back to it. My first instinct was to follow Arthur's plan. Take the money, leave Sparrow Creek, start over, just as he had wanted for his wife. I could buy a small apartment, get a job, live a quiet, anonymous life. I could be safe. The thought was intoxicating. It was a clean slate, a release from the crushing weight of my grief and poverty. I could just walk away from this cold, broken house and its sad story. But something held me back. Every time I looked at the peeling wallpaper, at the solid stone of the fireplace, at the view of the skeletal apple orchard through the newly cleaned windows, I felt a pang of something. It wasn't just a house. It was a testament. It was Arthur's last stand. He had given up everything to protect his family. He had let the world think he was a coward so they could be free. And Northridge Holdings, the same company he had written about, the descendants of the wolves who had driven him away, they were about to pave it all over. They were about to erase the last trace of him, to win the war he had fought so hard. To take the money and run felt like a betrayal. It felt like letting the wolves win. I thought about Liam. He had never known his grandfather's story. He had grown up believing his family was broken, that he came from a line of men who ran away. He had carried a quiet shame about it his whole life. Now, I knew the truth. His grandfather wasn't a coward. He was a hero. And Liam would have stayed. I knew it in my bones. He would have seen the fight through. He would have honored Arthur's sacrifice not by running, but by standing his ground. He would have saved this place. The choice became clear. It solidified in my heart with a painful, terrifying certainty. I couldn't run. This was my fight now. This farm wasn't a burden anymore. It was an inheritance, a legacy of courage, and I was not going to let it die. I separated the money. There was just over $60,000 in cash and bonds. I took out $50,000, the amount for the back taxes. The rest I set aside for repairs. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. It was a fighting chance. The next morning, I drove back into town. I walked into the courthouse, my steps sure and steady. Mr. Abernathy looked up from his desk, a flicker of surprise in his eyes when he saw me. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I was wondering when you'd be back. Figured the first cold snap might send you packing." "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice clear and strong. I placed the stacks of cash on his desk. It was a messy, chaotic pile of old bills. "I'm here to pay the taxes, all of them." Mr. Abernathy stared at the money, then back at me, his mouth slightly agape. He was speechless. He slowly reached out and touched one of the bundles, as if to confirm it was real. Where in God's name did you get this?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "I found it," I said simply. "It was in the house. It was left for me." I didn't tell him about the letters, about Arthur's story. Not yet. That was my ace in the hole. For now, the money was enough. He spent the next hour counting the cash, his movements slow and deliberate. He ran the bills through a counting machine twice. The final tally was just enough to cover the principal amount of the taxes owed. The interest and penalties could be put on a payment plan, he explained, now that the debt was secured. He typed furiously on his computer, printed out a series of documents, and stamped them with a final, echoing thud. He handed me a receipt. "It's done," he said, looking at me with a newfound respect. "The lien is lifted. Northridge can't touch it. The property is yours, free and clear, pending the payment plan." I walked out of the courthouse feeling 10 feet tall. The first battle was won. But I knew the war was far from over. Northridge Holdings wouldn't give up that easily. They had wanted this land for 40 years. They weren't going to be deterred by a piece of paper. The consequences of my choice arrived a week later in the form of a sleek, black SUV that crunched its way up my overgrown driveway. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was tall and polished, with a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He introduced himself as Mr. Davies, a representative from Northridge. "We were so surprised to hear the property had been claimed," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "And even more surprised to hear the taxes had been paid. You must be a very resourceful woman, Mrs. Caldwell." He didn't offer condolences for my husband. He didn't ask about my situation. He went straight to the point. He offered to buy the farm. The offer was generous. It was enough money to change my life completely. "Think of it," he said, gesturing to the dilapidated house. "You could be free of this burden. A new start, a beautiful apartment in the city, anything you want." It was the same temptation all over again, the easy way out. "The farm is not for sale," I said, my voice steady. His smile tightened. "Mrs. Caldwell, perhaps you don't understand. This house is a wreck. It's a money pit. The cost of repairs, of making it truly habitable, will be astronomical. Our offer is more than fair. It's a gift." "No, thank you," I said. His demeanor shifted. The silken voice became edged with steel. "This is a prime piece of real estate. It will be developed. It's inevitable. You can either walk away with a fortune, or you can be buried under the weight of this place. We can make this very difficult for you. Zoning permits, building codes, historical preservation statutes. There are many ways a project like this can fail." It was a threat, veiled in corporate jargon. He was telling me that the wolves were still here, and they had sharper teeth now. They had lawyers and regulations on their side. "I'll take my chances," I said, and I closed the front door in his face. The encounter left me shaken, but also resolute. They had shown their hand. They were bullies, and I was not going to be bullied. I knew I couldn't fight them alone. I needed help. I went back to Mr. Abernathy. I told him everything. I showed him the letters. I told him Arthur's story about the land fraud, the threats, the reason he had disappeared. As he read the letters, his face grew grim. He remembered the stories from 40 years ago, the rumors about that family, about their aggressive land acquisitions. "This changes things," he said, his voice low. "This isn't just a property dispute anymore. This is evidence of a crime." He told me he would start digging. He would look into the old property records, the original surveys Arthur had mentioned. He would act as my legal counsel. "They picked a fight with the wrong woman, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, a small, determined smile on his face. "And with the wrong county clerk." With the legal battle in Mr. Abernathy's capable hands, I turned my attention back to the house. I had a small amount of money left for repairs. I had to make it count. I couldn't afford a big crew, so I hired a local handyman, a grizzled old man named Ben, who had been recommended by the woman at the general store. Ben had lived in Sparrow Creek his whole life. He showed up in a battered pickup truck, took one look at the house, and let out a low whistle. "You got your work cut out for you, little lady," he said, but there was a twinkle in his eye. He remembered the Caldwells. He had been a boy when they disappeared. "Always wondered what happened to them," he said, looking at the house with a sad, knowing expression. "Arthur was a good man, stood up for folks." Ben was a master of his craft. He knew these old houses like the back of his hand. He taught me how to patch plaster, how to glaze a window, how to repair the sagging porch roof. We worked side by side, from sunup to sundown. The work was slow, grueling, and deeply satisfying. With every nail I hammered, with every board I replaced, I felt like I was healing the house, and in turn, healing myself. The community, at first wary of the stranger who had taken over the old ghost house, began to thaw. People would stop by with a thermos of hot coffee or a plate of sandwiches. The woman from the general store brought me a box of old curtains. An elderly farmer down the road offered me the use of his tractor to clear the overgrown fields. They saw I wasn't a developer. I wasn't there to flip the house. I was there to stay. I was putting down roots. I was becoming one of them. As I worked, I thought a lot about the meaning of home. For so long, home had been a person. It was Liam. When he died, I wasn't just heartbroken. I was homeless, in the truest sense of the word. I had lost my center, my place in the world. I thought I could find it again in a new apartment, a new city, a new life. But this old, broken farmhouse taught me something profound. Home isn't just a place you find. It's a place you make. You build it, nail by nail, memory by memory. You build it with your own two hands, with your sweat and your tears. You build it with the stories of those who came before you, and with the hope for those who will come after. This house, with its ghosts and its secrets, had become my home. It was a place built on a foundation of love and sacrifice, and I was now a part of its story. I was the keeper of Arthur's legacy. The news from Mr. Abernathy came on a cold day in early spring. Northridge had officially withdrawn their claim. The evidence from Arthur's letters, combined with the discrepancies Mr. Abernathy had uncovered in the old county surveys, was enough. The state attorney general's office had opened an investigation into the company's historical land dealings. The wolves were finally being held accountable. The war was over. I had won. I received the news not with a shout of triumph, but with a quiet, profound sense of peace. I walked out onto the newly repaired porch and looked out at my land. The skeletal apple trees were beginning to show the first blush of green buds. The fields, cleared of their thorny brush, were ready for planting. The house stood straight and proud behind me, its windows clean and shining in the afternoon sun. It was still a work in progress. It would always be a work in progress. But it was mine. It was safe. That evening, I took Arthur's letters out of their box. I sat in front of the fireplace, the same fireplace where he had likely sat with his wife, and I read his last letter one more time. "Tell our son I was a good man. I looked into the flames, and I whispered my reply into the quiet of the house. He knew, I said, and now, so do I. I had found more than just money in the walls of that old farmhouse. I had found a story. I had found a purpose. I had found a home. And in doing so, I had finally, truly, found my way back to myself. And so, my life began again. Not a new life, but a continuation of one. A life built on the foundations of the past. I started a small garden that summer, planting the seeds of tomatoes, cucumbers, and hope. The work was hard, but it was good work. It was real. I learned the rhythms of the seasons, the language of the land. I learned that resilience isn't about avoiding the storms, it's about learning how to rebuild after they pass. My story is a strange one, I know. It's a story about a $5 house and a 40-year-old secret. But I think, at its heart, it's a story about what we inherit. We inherit our family's eyes, their smiles, their way of telling a story. But we also inherit their struggles, their secrets, and their unfinished business. We have a choice. We can run from that inheritance, or we can face it. We can choose to be defined by the burdens of the past, or we can choose to transform them into a source of strength. I chose to stay. I chose to fight. And in that old, forgotten farmhouse, I found my second chance. So I want to ask you one last time, what have you inherited? What unfinished story is waiting for you to pick it up? Your home